The candles are dying one by one. You're standing in a chamber beneath vaulted ceilings painted with angels and saints, their gilded faces reflecting firelight that shivers across marble floors. The air smells of wine, sweat, and something darker fear dressed in silk. 50 women, stripped of every thread they wore, crawl between the legs of men draped in scarlet and gold, and seated on a throne built for prayer. Watching it all with eyes that gleam with satisfaction is the most powerful man in Christendom, the Pope himself. This is October 30th, 1503. Inside the Apostolic Palace of the Vatican, what you're witnessing is only the beginning. Before we descend further into this night, I need to know where in the world are you watching from. It's extraordinary how a story buried in PayPal archives for centuries can reach screens across every continent. Drop your location below, and if you stay until the moment that unsettles you most, you'll understand why some truths refuse to die. The event I'm about to describe isn't folklore. It's documented, recorded by Johann Burchard, the Vatican's master of ceremonies, a man who witnessed papal scandals for years, but called this night something that made his hand tremble as he wrote, "What happened in those sacred rooms shattered the boundary between divine authority and human depravity, so completely that it would fuel the Protestant Reformation, reshape the Catholic Church, and brand one family name with infamy that 5 centuries couldn't wash away." This is the story of Lucretia Borgia's third wedding night, and what they did to her what they made others watch became one of the darkest stains ever written into Vatican history. The marriage had been announced that autumn with bells ringing across Rome, echoing off ancient stone and carrying news that spread like contagion through Italy's courts. Pope Alexander VI Rodrigo Borgia declared that his daughter would marry again. Third time, twice widowed under circumstances that reeked of poison and blades in the dark. But this time, the ceremony wouldn't hide in some distant palazzo. It would unfold inside the Vatican itself, beneath frescoes meant to represent heaven's judgment. The groom was Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. Young, educated, terrified, he knew Lucretia's history. Every nobleman in Italy did. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, had fled Rome in the night, swearing assassins hunted him. Her second, Alfonso of Aragon, had been strangled on Vatican steps, rumors pointing directly at Lucretia's brother, Cesare Borgia, the man they called Il Valentino, whose name alone emptied rooms and silenced arguments. Now another Alfonso was being bound to the Borgia bloodline, and he understood what that meant. He tried everything to escape. Diplomatic delays, excuses threaded through emissaries, pleading letters sent north toward his father, Duke Eccoli d'Este. But Alexander VI was not a man who tolerated refusal. His message arrived in Ferrara with the weight of divine command: accept this marriage or be destroyed. If the d'Este family resisted, Caesar's army, seasoned, merciless, legendary for their brutality, would march on Ferrara. The duchy would burn. The family would be excommunicated, stripped of legitimacy, isolated from allies. Italy had learned this truth well. No one survived a conflict with the Borgias. Duke Ercole, calculating survival over pride, ordered his son to travel to Rome, to surrender. Meanwhile, inside her Vatican apartments, Lucretia Borgia stood at a window overlooking the Eternal City, her face carved with a sorrow far older than her 21 years. Europe had painted her as a seductress, a poisoner, a woman who manipulated kings like chess pieces. But those who lived near her knew a different truth. She was not the architect of her fate. She was a pawn. Her first marriage had been annulled the moment it ceased to benefit her father's ambitions. Her second husband, whom she had genuinely loved, was murdered before her eyes, and she could neither prevent it nor avenge it. Her attendants whispered that she woke in the dead of night, clutching her chest. Trembling from nightmares she refused to speak of. She knew this third marriage wouldn't bring love. But even she couldn't imagine what her wedding night would become. Something was gathering behind Vatican walls, something calculated, something cruel. Alfonso d'Este entered Rome in December, his small escort trailing him through frozen mountain passes and roads slick with winter rain. But nothing prepared him for the sight of the Vaticana stone colossus rising above the city, half bathed in candlelight, half lost in scaffolding. It looked less like the heart of Christianity and more like a fortress built to swallow those who dared oppose it. Inside, the welcome was overwhelming. Alexander VI sat upon his throne, robed in shimmering white and gold that reflected firelight like molten metal. Beside him stood Cesare, silent, motionless, terrifying in his restraint. Though only 26, Cesare Borgia was already feared across Italy. Entire families vanished at his command. Cities surrendered at his approach. When his eyes locked onto Alfonso's, the meaning was unmistakable. "You are no guest here." Over the following weeks, Alfonso endured humiliation disguised as celebration. At banquets, he was seated beside courtesans, while high-ranking clergy watched with thinly concealed amusement. During hunts, Cesare displayed ruthless skill that felt more like a warning than sport every arrow that found its mark. Every beast that fell, a reminder of who commanded not only armies, but fear itself. At receptions, Alexander made pointed remarks about the tragic ends of Lucretia's previous husbands, hinting almost cheerfully how short the life of a Borgia son-in-law tended to be. Alfonso tried to preserve what remained of his dignity, but by then he was a prisoner wrapped in ceremony. His nights were kept isolated in Vatican chambers under flimsy excuses. Guards watched his door. Every passing hour revealed the truth more clearly. He had walked into a trap, and there was no path back out. The marriage was a facade. The real purpose was far more vicious. The Borgias intended to break the d'Este family's pride, humiliate them before Italy, and show every noble house from Florence to Naples that their will could crush any lineage, no matter how old or powerful. And while Alfonso endured this quiet psychological siege, preparations of a very different nature were unfolding deep within the Vatican. Cesare took personal command of the wedding night's feast. His vision pushed far beyond what even Rome's most decadent circles would dare whisper aloud. Behind closed doors, he met with his father to finalize details that would have horrified any soul who still held the church in reverence. 50 of the most striking courtesans in Rome were hand-selected and taken into secret chambers beneath the palace. These were not ordinary prostitutes. They were educated, refined women who frequented the salons of nobles. Many trembled when they learned what the Pope expected of them, yet none dared defy the head of Christendom. They were ordered to dress in lavish velvet and silk garments they would later be compelled to remove. They were escorted through hidden passageways, led by lantern light, so that on the night of the wedding they could be funneled into the papal apartments without warning. Servants who witnessed these preparations crossed themselves repeatedly, whispering prayers that clung to their lips like frost. They knew something unholy had begun to rise within the walls of the Vatican. Even Lucretia sensed it. Though deliberately excluded from most preparations, she felt the dark tension thickening in the air. Her maids reported unfamiliar faces slipping through corridors, courtesans appearing in rooms where they did not belong, and Cesare moving about with a smile that made their blood run cold. The night before the wedding, Unable to endure the suffocating atmosphere, Lucretia fled to the Sistine Chapel. Beneath Michelangelo's vast, thunderous sky beneath, the painted hand of God reaching toward Adam, she collapsed to her knees. She prayed not for love or happiness. She prayed for rescue, an intervention, a sign, anything at all, but the chapel remained silent. The divine felt impossibly distant. The candles flickered in the winter air as though straining to stay alive. Outside, the Vatican prepared for a celebration that would blur the line between sacred ritual and unspeakable corruption. October 30th dawned with the grandeur of a papal wedding. The bells of St. Peter's echoed over the 7 hills of Rome. Crowds thronged the streets surrounding the Vatican, eager to glimpse the infamous bride. Inside the Apostolic Palace, Lucretia was prepared by a dozen attendants. She wore a gown of shimmering silk embroidered with gold, glowing like liquid flame beneath the candles. Her hair, long bright, carefully braided with pearls, fell down her shoulders in intricate plaits. Her face was pale, powdered to mask the exhaustion and fear beneath her eyes. When she looked into the mirror, she did not see a bride. She saw a sacrifice. The ceremony was held in the papal chapel, a chamber drowning in gilded walls and holy paintings. Alexander VI officiated personally, his booming voice filling the sacred space as he bound Alfonso and Lucretia together before God. Rows of scarlet-clad cardinals stood rigidly along the chapel, their expressions carefully carved into masks of devotion. But behind their practiced piety flickered something else: dread. After the ceremony, the guests were escorted to the Borgia Apartments halls, resplendent with frescoes painted by Pinturicchio. Stories of saints, heroes, and myths stretched across walls, now tainted by the debauchery that approached. Enormous tables overflowed with roasted boar, pheasants still adorned in their feathers, piles of exotic fruit, and goblets of wine from the finest vineyards in Italy. Cardinals, Roman nobles, emissaries from Ferrara, and hand-picked courtiers filled the room. Alfonso and Lucretia sat at the head table, trapped in a celebration that already felt unreal, like a masquerade masking something darker beneath. At first, the banquet unfolded like any noble feast. Gentle music from lutes and viols drifted through the air. Toasts were offered, hollow compliments exchanged, polite diplomacy performed, but as the night deepened, the atmosphere shifted. Alexander, already flushed from heavy drinking, grew louder, more jubilant. Caesar, silent until then, slowly rose and delivered a subtle command with a tilt of his head. The massive doors slammed shut. Guards took their positions. No one would leave this room. What happened next tore through the last remaining boundary between decadence and depravity. At Caesar's signal, the side doors opened, and 50 courtesans stepped into the hall draped in velvet and jewels, but unable to hide the terror in their eyes. A hush fell over the room. Then Alexander rose from his throne, smiling as if unveiling a masterpiece, and announced that the true entertainment was about to begin. At his command, the courtesans began to strip themselves of every layer of silk and velvet, letting their dazzling garments slip to the marble floor until they stood completely naked before the assembly. The cathedral, built for prayer now, stared at a scene torn from a blasphemous dream. Cardinals turned their heads away, their trembling fingers tracing frantic crosses over their chests. Some tried to rise and flee, but the guards at the doors shifted forward, hands resting on their swords, making it unmistakably clear that no one would escape this spectacle. Alfonso could only stare, his face frozen in disbelief and revulsion. Lucretia sat beside him, petrified, her tears streaming silently, soaking into the silk of her wedding dress, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles blanched white. Then came the Pope's next order. The naked courtesans were commanded to dance between the long banquet tables. Servants lit towering candelabras, and the flames cast jagged shadows across the frescoed walls. The women moved through the flickering light like spectral figures, their silhouettes twisting across the holy painting saints and angels watching silently as the Vatican devolved into a pagan ritual. But Alexander was only beginning. In an act crafted solely to degrade, he ordered baskets of chestnuts to be brought in and scattered across the polished marble floor. The nuts rolled between the feet of horrified guests, the sound echoing like faint thunder. Then the Pope announced the next phase of his depravity. The courtesans were to crawl on all fours between the legs of cardinals and nobles to collect the chestnuts like animals driven into a grotesque contest. The woman who gathered the most would be rewarded with silk cloaks, gold jewelry, and treasures from the papal vault. The humiliation that followed was so extreme that Johann Burchard, hardened by years of witnessing the Vatican's darkest moments, later wrote that he struggled to describe it in words. 50 naked women crawled across the sacred Vatican floor, between the robes of church princes, while Alexander and Cesare watched from an elevated platform, laughing, pointing, placing bets, as if this were a cheap performance in a brothel, not the beating heart of Christendom. Some young cardinals, drunk and overwhelmed by the night's madness, laughed and cheered. Others bowed their heads, crushed by the war between their faith and their terror of the Pope. Alfonso sat motionless, unable to comprehend that this nightmare was part of his wedding feast in the Vatican itself, under the eyes of the man who claimed to speak for God. And Lucretia, her wedding dress, had become a shroud. Her tears had dried into a frozen expression of emptiness. She had always known her father and brother were capable of monstrous things, but she had never imagined they would turn her wedding into a ritual of damnation. Yet even now, the night had not reached its darkest point. As midnight approached and the Vatican clocks told 12, Alexander finally declared the end of the chestnut banquet. The naked courtesans, exhausted, huddled in corners with their humiliating prizes. Wine soaked the tables. Guests sat frozen, half drunk, half stunned, entirely broken. Alexander, however, was clear-headed, focused, intent, and his next command silenced the hall so completely that one could hear the candles crackle. With a voice dripping in authority, he announced that the sacred duty of marriage now had to be fulfilled. But what he ordered next crushed whatever remained of dignity in the room. He proclaimed that Alfonso d'Este must prove the marriage with Lucretia not once, but 3 times, and not in private. Every witness present was to remain in place to verify that the union was sealed irrevocably before both the Church and the world. The hall descended into horrified silence. Even Cesare, whose name was synonymous with brutality, looked sharply at his father, caught off guard by the sheer audacity of the decree. Alfonso rose slowly, his face drained of all color. He was a prince raised on ideals of honor and duty, but surrounded now by Caesar's armed men, their hands gripping their sword hilts, he understood there was no refusing this command. He turned to look at Lucretia. She trembled like a bird trapped beneath a predator's shadow. Her eyes were vacant, her spirit already battered past the point of resistance. Her lips moved, but no sound escaped. Under the murderous gaze of the guards and the expectant stare of the Pope, Alfonso had no choice. He escorted Lucretia toward an adjoining chamber room normally used for receiving diplomats, now transformed into a furnished bridal chamber. The doors remained wide open. No privacy, no humanity. Those who had not fled were forced to stand in the outer room, in full view of what was about to take place. What followed was not a union. It was the destruction of two human beings. Witnesses stared in stunned silence. Some whispered desperate prayers, others cried quietly. Even the courtesans, victims of their own degradation, looked away in grief. And as the night dragged on and the Pope's horrific order unfolded step by step, a single unspoken truth filled the Vatican. Something sacred had died in that palace, and Rome would never be the same again. By the time the night dragged into its final hours, Lucretia had slipped into a state beyond exhaustion, beyond fear. Her mind, desperate to survive, had separated from the nightmare unfolding around her. She moved mechanically, without thought, as if her spirit had fled her body to escape the horror she could no longer fight. And then, just as the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows of the Borgia apartments, Pope Alexander VI issued the command for the third and final fulfillment of his monstrous decree. Cesare was present again, watching coldly, overseeing every detail with the same clinical detachment he used on the battlefield. When the ordeal was completed, he announced triumphantly that the marriage was now bound, 3 times sealed, in the eyes of both the Church and the law. Impossible to challenge or undo. Alexander VI lifted his wine cup in satisfaction, smiling as if the night had been nothing more than an extravagant celebration instead of a descent into moral abyss. What remained in the room were the survivors, a collection of broken souls. Cardinals who had entered the apartment draped in scarlet as servants of God now stood as unwilling witnesses to an atrocity they could never confess. Their silence, their inaction, had made them accomplices. When the sun rose fully over Rome, it revealed devastation. Empty wine jugs. Chestnuts crushed into the marble floor. Exhausted courtesans curled in corners. Guards standing like statues, eyes downcast. In the adjoining chamber, Lucretia lay completely still, staring upward as if the ceiling itself were miles away. Her body remained in the room, but her spirit was elsewhere, somewhere unreachable. Alfonso sat at the edge of the bed, trembling violently, his face buried in his hands. Nothing in his life, no battlefield, no political threat, had ever shattered him like this night. There was no revenge powerful enough to restore what had been taken from him. Within days, he left Rome quietly, broken beyond repair, returning to Ferrara with a silence he would carry for the rest of his life. Not once did he ever speak of the night again.